And just to give us a sense of how long did you then stay on in law as a career?
Well, so my whole career in law was 10 years. Now, I did started off in The Hague. Then I did the more, I'm calling it traditional big law gig. And when I say big law, I mean these mega law firms in New York, London, Hong Kong, Tokyo. Like, they're these global law firms where they do some of the most complicated work in the world, but very demanding of the associates and the partners. Did that for 5 years in New York, 4 or 5 years. I did a mix of mergers and acquisitions, financing, and what I call tech transactions. Now there's tech transactions everywhere, but back then there weren't as many tech transactions groups. But those were groups, and this is what kind of got me into tech, doing deals with media companies or tech companies, or doing deals where you're figuring out how to handle trademarks, patents, copyrights, either being sold, being licensed. I was doing those kinds of deals, and I happened to get very lucky and worked on a deal that Google was involved in. And so as much as I was like doing the big law thing, I did a deal with Google and a bunch of other big tech companies. And a few months later, the Google lawyers reached out and said, hey, we have some openings. Are you interested in applying? And that was then the jumping off spot to come into where I am now at Google.
Okay. Wow, amazing. Interesting. And then you did another pivot a few years later, and you went from legal to business development. Tell us more.
I guess this is... Thanks, I will. Yeah, that's, I guess, a long way of getting to where I am now. So I did big law firm. Then I did in-house law, which is how we met when I was a lawyer at Google, and I supported, different products, including product we worked on, travel.
There, yes.
And the lifestyle is very different, right? Like law firm life and in-house legal life, night and day. And you ask how I pivoted to business, and I think the answer is that this seed was planted early on, even when I was a lawyer at a law firm. And the seed that was planted was seeing my clients, that the business leads, where they were, to use, I guess, an American expression, right, quarterbacking a deal. As much as it was important for the lawyers to be there, ultimately that deal was owned by and responsible to the business lead. And that business lead had to liaise with legal and finance and marketing and like all these other functions to get the deal over the line. And maybe it was a little bit of grass is greener, or, oh, that job looks cooler than mine. But I think there was a seed there of like, what they do is very interesting to me. And that continued on, even when I was a lawyer at Google, seeing folks like you, your teams, the other teams I worked with. I loved the partner-facing element of that. I think lawyers are partner-facing when it comes to negotiating the deal, hammering out the points that are, open. And so you get that skill, which, by the way, I think is a skill unto itself. But I really yearned for what I call the first half of the deal, which is identifying the partners, building the relationship, building out the deal model, figuring out, is there something there for the partner and for my company? And so for many years, it was just something I was aspiring to. And I got an opportunity about 5 years ago to make the move. And lo and behold, this lesson we hear about networking is everything. It was a former client of mine. He was a BD guy. I was his lawyer. He had an opening and knew that I wanted to make this move, knew my demeanor, how I could think through deals. And he gave me a shot, and I'll never forget that. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude.
Oh, amazing. So there was someone who kind of helped you into that, making that transition.
Yeah, a good friend now, as someone who's still a Googler. And, one of those lessons is you just never know where these networks are going to lead.
The connection pans out.
At the time, we were just friends. We liked working together. And then lo and behold, he's helping me change careers.
Yeah. So then, and in terms of what were your initial assumptions as you were going into that change then?
I feel dumb looking back, thinking about these assumptions, because it was just a little bit naive. I was in my legal bubble working with BD people, and I just assumed they would understand that a deal lawyer can do BD. Lear, I have to tell you, I was disappointed or shocked at like how long it took, because I would put out these applications thinking, and this is, I suppose, hubris or whatever, naivety, thinking like, oh, they're going to see my application and understand that I can do deals and I know contracts and I know negotiations and all this stuff. I barely got any traction for the first 6 months. And this is even applying internally within Google. Forget external applications with people who don't know me. And it was a wake-up call. And I remember talking to a BD director who was a former lawyer. And I said, I was like, hey, Mike, like, what am I doing wrong? And he gave me advice that changed everything for me. And his advice was sort of three things. He's like, they're looking for standard candidates, people who have their MBA, who have BD experience. You're completely atypical. So in your introductory email or cover letter, or whatever it is, you need to dispel all of these myths that people may have about you. So you need to play to your strengths. One, let them know that when it comes to negotiations and contracting, nobody does it better because that's your job, right? You're the lawyer. Number two, you've been at Google long enough, you know how to hit the ground running and how to navigate internally, processes, cross-functional teams. Let them know that these first two buckets, which are huge in the business development world, check. And in the third bucket, which is learning the product, is something that almost anyone is going to have to do anyway. Even if they're a BD person from elsewhere, you come to a new team, there's an inevitable learning curve. So I started to send out these, I call it cover emails, right? Of like, hey, I'm interested in your role. This is why I might be a good candidate. Like that, every single hiring manager wrote back being like, hey, I'd love to learn more.
Oh, wow.
But it took 6 months of just getting rejection after rejection after rejection. And it wasn't dire. Like I was, my legal job was good. Wasn't in a rush, but I was surprised at how long it took.
Conception that others had of you as a lawyer and how that you had to take really active steps to dispel some of these preconceived notions that others had about you.
That's exactly right. And on top of that, the other place where I was naive is I just thought BD was BD. Like the teams I worked with, that's what all BD was. Turns out that's not the case. Now, whether you call it business development or partnerships, those words can be interchangeable, but depending on who you talk to or what company you talk to, they may have different meanings, right? Some are internal facing, some are external facing, some are meant to drive revenue, some are meant not to. And so it turns out I was applying to roles with hiring managers who just never really had to work with legal that much or had to do deals that were contentious. And so I think those hiring managers would look at me being like, why would I ever hire a lawyer? Whereas other teams would be like, oh, we work with legal all the time. I understand why that would be a transferable skill. Did I know that there was like this huge range of what business development means?
Yeah, absolutely. The sales teams, the strategic partnerships folks, the M&A conversations, right? Mergers and acquisitions type stuff. Yeah.
And the other one I would add, which is really big in the big tech companies, is what I call product partnerships. Right? So these are teams who are deal making, but they do the bidding of the product team. Product team, they say, hey, we're building this thing, but we need data. This other company has that data or that capability. Can you just make sure we have a licensing deal in place? And you don't necessarily have to think through who's the partner, why is this the right partner? You're just taking instructions from other people as to who to partner with. I didn't even know that was possible, but it absolutely is.
Yeah, that's great. And so with all these assumptions and what you had to do then to dispel it, what did you fear the most when you had to, what did you fear losing the most when you had to make that switch?
The number one thing I'd say is identity. Like there was something to be said of like, hey, what do you do? And I know in some cultures that question isn't asked very often, in others it is.
Yeah.
But I think over time I was a lawyer for over a decade. And part of it was just like, this is who I am. This is what I do. And all of a sudden you don't do that. And it's hard then to describe to people, well, I do business development. What does that mean? Is that sales? Is that marketing? Is that something else? Whereas when you tell people you're a lawyer, it's kind of like, oh, okay. And so it sounds silly, but it was like a harsh reality where like that next day I was like, well, I guess I can't say I'm a lawyer anymore. So there was a little bit of that fear of like losing your identity. There was also, and I will still feel this way, so I'll tell you, imposter syndrome. So I'm surrounded, right, by people who are in the job and have come to this job in a very different way than I have. They've gone to business school. Maybe they worked as consultants or bankers, or they did BD previously. And so here I am, I'm like, oh my God, I never went to business school. And like all these stories they're talking about, I can't relate because I went to law school and I'm like the weirdo. And so that imposter syndrome, I think I still feel. I try and remind myself that it's okay. But that's something I still work on because I'm not the traditional person in this role. That was a big fear of mine of like, how do I fit in or prove yourself?